Before you dismiss the manosphere as just internet toxic culture, there's something important you should understand. From a psychological perspective, movements like this usually appear when large numbers of people are experiencing the same emotional wounds. And there's one attachment pattern driving much of this conversation that almost nobody is talking about. If we don't understand that pattern, we're going to completely misunderstand why the manosphere keeps growing. If you've watched the new Netflix documentary Manosphere, you may have walked away feeling disturbed, confused, or maybe even angry. But as a relationship and attachment trauma practitioner, what stood out to me wasn't just the ideology being discussed. What stood out was the psychology underneath it. Because what we're really witnessing here is not just an online movement about masculinity or dating. We're seeing the psychological consequences of widespread attachment injuries playing out in modern culture. One of the most striking themes in the documentary is loneliness. You see young men describing rejection, isolation, and the feeling of being invisible in the dating world. Now, culturally, when these conversations happen, the response often becomes polarized. People jump quickly to criticism or to blame. But psychologically, loneliness is one of the most powerful attachment signals the human brain can experience. Humans are biologically wired for connection. So when connection repeatedly fails, whether through rejection, emotional neglect, or social isolation, the brain experiences what psychologists call attachment distress. And attachment distress looks for relief. Sometimes that relief comes through supportive relationships, but sometimes it comes through communities and belief systems that explain the pain. Movements like the Manosphere often provide exactly that. They offer a narrative that helps people make sense of their experience. But here's the part of the conversation that almost nobody wants to talk about. The emotional pain driving many of these conversations is real. The question is, how does that pain get interpreted? Another theme that appears repeatedly in the documentary is the message that women are responsible for modern dating problems. From a psychological perspective, this is actually a very, very common coping strategy. When someone experiences repeated rejection, the emotional impact can be very intense. And research shows that rejection activates many of the same brain regions associated with physical pain. So the mind looks for protection. And one way it protects itself is through externalizing blame. Instead of the narrative becoming, I feel hurt or I feel unworthy, the narrative becomes, women are the problem. This doesn't mean the pain isn't real. It means the mind has shifted from vulnerability to defense. And when that narrative spreads through communities, it can become incredibly reinforcing. And in a moment, I'm going to explain why emotional suppression may be one of the biggest psychological drivers behind these movements. But first, we need to understand another important piece of the puzzle. The documentary emphasized the idea that men must dominate in relationships in order to succeed. But from an attachment psychology perspective, dominance often has very different psychological meaning. What looks like confidence on the surface can actually be avoidant attachment behavior. Avoidantly attached individuals often experience emotional closeness as threatening. Intimacy can feel like loss of control. So instead of leaning into emotional connection, they rely on strategies like power, distance, and control. Dominance becomes a way to protect themselves from vulnerability. You might see this play out in relationships where one partner struggles to express emotion and instead focuses heavily on independence, status, or control. From the outside, it may look like strength or confidence, but psychologically, it can sometimes reflect a deeper fear that vulnerability will lead to rejection or loss of power. And that pattern often reflects avoidant attachment. And this is the attachment pattern I mentioned at the beginning that many people overlook. Now, the Manosphere also promotes the concept of the alpha male. Interestingly, this idea originally came from early interpretations of wolf behavior research. Yes, wolves. But the scientists who conducted those studies later clarified that the original interpretation was incorrect. In reality, wolf packs function more like families than dominant hierarchies. And in human relationships, the traits that predict long-term connection are not dominance or intimidation. They are emotional regulation, empathy, and psychological security. In other words, what actually sustains relationships is emotional safety. Securely attached individuals are able to express both strength and vulnerability. And that combination is far more powerful than any dominance narrative. Now let's come back to something I mentioned earlier. One of the most important psychological dynamics underlying all of this is emotional suppression. Many boys grow up hearing messages like, don't cry, don't show weakness, don't talk about emotional pain. But when emotions are suppressed long enough, they don't disappear, they simply transform. Sometimes they become anger, sometimes they become resentment, and sometimes they become movements that channel emotional pain into ideology. From an attachment perspective, this often reflects avoidant attachment development, where emotional needs were never safely acknowledged. So what I believe the documentary only partially captures is that the Manosphere is not simply about ideology. It's about attachment wounds playing out at scale. Behind movements like this are individuals trying to make sense of their emotional pain. And when society fails to provide healthier models of connection, those wounds will find expression somewhere, sometimes in ways that deepen division. If we want to truly understand movements like the Manosphere, we have to look beyond surface arguments. At the core of this conversation is something deeply human. People want to feel seen. They want to feel valued. People want to feel loved. And when those needs go unmet long enough, culture begins to reflect that pain. If you're interested in understanding how attachment styles shape relationships, emotional safety, and modern dating dynamics, that's exactly what we explore here. I'm Bev Mitelman, founder of Securely Loved, and I'll see you in our next video.